Under the girl's body, there was a little boy who was also sitting with his knees hugged. His injuries were not as severe as the girl's, but he also had blunt force trauma on his face. The girl's wounds were mainly on her right cheekbone, while his were on his mouth. The two children were killed, and the village was not big. The police almost immediately matched the only missing report nearby. A family in Baigua village reported that their two children had disappeared half a month ago. They were siblings. The sister was 13 years old, named Li Tong, and the brother was 10 years old, named Li Bin. The place where the bodies were found was too remote, and it would take several hours to drive to the nearest funeral home. The key was that the bodies were too badly damaged and might be destroyed if moved. We decided to set up a shed on the mountain and conduct an autopsy on the spot. The police were still digging out the brother's body. We took the sister Li Tong's body to the mountain, borrowed electricity from the villagers, turned on the light, and borrowed water to wash it briefly. 2 tables were put together to make a dissecting table, and the light shone on the girl's body. Her only remaining left eye was open, and her pupilless eye was dark, as if staring at the night sky. I hesitated a bit. This was a child, and her family would care more. Should I wait for them to come and discuss before cutting? The old forensic doctor looked at the body and said, "No, start now. Get ready, I'll peel the face today." Peeling the face was a nearly lost forensic technique, which meant using a knife to completely peel off the skin and flesh of the corpse's face, like taking off a human skin mask, exposing the complete facial skeleton. This technique was generally used for suffocated corpses to observe the facial injuries caused by suffocation, but there was another extremely rare situation, which was the case now, to observe the injuries of the facial bones. I understood why the old forensic doctor did this. We were forensic doctors, and our biggest responsibility was to fix all the traces of injury as evidence. The girl should not suffer every bit of pain in vain. The silver dissecting knife tip picked up the sticky clothes and skin, and I cut the pink Peppa Pig shirt bit by bit. There was a thin ring of bruise on the girl's wrist, which should have been tied with hemp rope. This was the beginning of the torture. Her fingers were soft. Her arms and legs were too, and they would bend in the middle when turned over, obviously fractured. Without any hesitation, I picked up her palm, cut it from the back of her hand, and followed the position of the finger bones in my impression, separating the muscles of her fingers and looking for bones. Forensic autopsies rarely cut this position, because palm injuries are rarely fatal and do not affect the autopsy results, and they are not easy to cut or sew. But I just wanted to do more and get more evidence, even if it was redundant. The fingers were too small, and I had to give up holding the knife and use my fingers to hold the blade and slide it down. The tiny bone stubble was mixed with the swollen and greasy flesh and blood, completely losing its shape. 10 fingers, 3 bone fractures. The girl's right hand had another fracture at the root of the 3rd metacarpal, but the fracture force was obviously lighter than the fingers. I didn't believe that the killer suddenly softened his heart and hand. I simulated the action in my mind, holding her hand with one hand, and hitting her fingers with a hammer with the other. The girl must have struggled desperately. For a moment, she broke free, and the killer smashed her palm indiscriminately. The severe pain made the girl lose the ability to resist again, and the hammer hit it again. Then there was beating and kicking. The girl's ribs broke 3, and one of them pierced her internal organs. Both kidneys and liver had lacerated wounds. I had never seen such pale organs in an autopsy, even the heart was a grayish-white color. This meant that when she was alive, the blood in her body was almost drained. The girl fell to the ground, and the killer looked at her face, and swung the most vengeful hammer at her eyes. I handed the dissecting knife to the old forensic doctor, and he peeled the face. The dissecting knife cut from the temple, circled the jawbone, and circled the hairline. It was a complete circle, just like a human skin mask. This was the range we were going to peel off. But the harder part was to use the knife to cut the tendons of the face bit by bit, so that the face of the corpse was separated from the flesh and bones. The temporary table was not high enough, and the old forensic doctor bent over, holding the girl's face with one hand and probing the dissecting knife with the other. After cutting for a few seconds, he suddenly frowned and pulled out his hand. The blade broke, and the girl's nasal bone broke in the place where the nasal cavity should have been empty, hitting the blade. The old forensic doctor changed another knife and continued to cut down. This time he finally cut off all the tendons. He pressed the girl's face with his left hand and slowly lifted it along the edge with the other hand, and took off the whole face. Now, we could clearly see the girl's injuries near the nasal bone, cheekbone, and orbital bone. My feeling was not wrong. There was a very regular circular depression on the cheekbone, a textbook-like blunt force trauma. I could even imagine that it was a small hammer that was not heavy, a horn hammer. The same thing hit the girl's fingers. Massive hemorrhage of the kidneys, pulmonary hemorrhage, liver rupture, nasal bone fracture causing blood to block the trachea. These 4 injuries could kill an adult in 20 minutes. But all these injuries were ante-mortem. Finally, the craniotomy confirmed the last fatal injury, a similar blunt force trauma at the occipital bone. When I saw that wound, I almost sighed with relief. Intracranial hemorrhage, death within 10 seconds. All the pain she suffered was finally over.